When people speak about the disaster of 1755, most attention goes to the earthquake and the fires. But there was a third blow that proved decisive and profoundly changed the way Portugal looked at its own coastline: the tsunami. In Lisbon, the Tagus was not just scenery. It was the main route through which people, goods, political authority, and imperial wealth entered the kingdom. The city lived facing the water. The quays, warehouses, Ribeira district, administrative buildings, and daily contact with the port made the waterfront one of the nerve centers of the realm. And it was precisely there that destruction acquired a new dimension. After the earthquake shocks of the morning of November 1, 1755, many inhabitants fled toward open ground by the river, believing the waterfront would be safer than narrow streets and collapsing buildings. But the Tagus withdrew unnaturally. The riverbed became visible in several points, and shortly afterward great waves entered the lower city. What had seemed like refuge turned into a corridor of death. The tsunami struck vessels, damaged port infrastructure, swept away people, worsened the logistical collapse of the capital, and demonstrated brutally a reality that Portuguese experience had not fully integrated before. Proximity to the sea was a source of power, but also of extreme danger. Before that moment, Portuguese coastal security had been imagined mainly in military terms: defense of harbor mouths, control of bars and estuaries, fortifications, maritime vigilance, and protection of trade. It was a logic shaped by corsairs, rival fleets, piracy, storms, and silting. The tsunami introduced a different layer. The sea was not only a route, a frontier, or a theater of war. It could also become an abrupt force of devastation on an urban, economic, administrative, and human scale. That does not mean that in 1755 Portugal suddenly created a uniform national plan for every stretch of coast. That would be an exaggeration. But there was clearly a change in mentality among administrators, engineers, and political decision-makers. Lisbon became the great laboratory of that shift. The reconstruction directed under Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the future Marquis of Pombal, did not simply rebuild what had been lost. The new downtown imposed order on a fabric that had previously been more irregular and vulnerable. Wider streets, standardized blocks, strict alignments, broad squares, and improved circulation were not merely aesthetic choices. They had practical consequences for safety, evacuation, supply, control of the city, and response to catastrophe. The waterfront, too, came to be thought about with greater administrative rationality. Contact with the river remained essential, but the relationship between city, port, circulation, and public space became more controlled. The political and commercial heart of Reconstruction, centered on the new Praça do Comércio and the reorganized lower town facing the Tagus, expresses this clearly: preserve maritime connection, but subordinate it to a geometry of much more disciplined management and power. There was also the technical question. The Pombaline cage is usually remembered as a response to seismic risk, rightly so. But its broader meaning goes beyond the individual building. It represents an engineering culture that began to view the city as a vulnerable system rather than a random collection of houses. After 1755, the idea of urban resilience gained more weight. In coastal and port zones, that meant thinking more carefully about the location of critical functions, the solidity of public buildings, routes of circulation, and the ability to keep the state functioning after a shock. The disaster also reinforced the role of military engineers and technical surveying. In Portugal, military engineering already had a strong tradition in fortifications, ports, harbor works, and public infrastructure. After 1755, knowledge of terrain, exposure to the sea, urban organization, and response to extreme scenarios became even more valuable. It was not an instantaneous revolution along the whole Portuguese coast, but it was a major push toward a more technical understanding of territorial security. Another decisive consequence was administrative. The catastrophe showed that coastal security depended not only on walls or cannons. It also depended on how quickly political authority could control space, distribute food, prevent chaos, isolate dangerous zones, and reactivate economic circuits. In other words, security came to be seen more broadly, involving urban planning, policing, logistics, public health, and territorial management. That is one of the most modern legacies of the post-1755 moment. Instead of thinking only about defending the coast from an external enemy, the state began to treat coastal exposure as a complex problem of governance. This helps explain why the earthquake, tsunami, and fires had such a deep effect on strengthening centralized Pombaline power. There was also a symbolic impact. Lisbon was the showcase of empire. When the sea destroyed part of the capital, it became clear that Atlantic wealth did not make the kingdom invulnerable. Dependence on the coast was a strength, but also a structural weakness. From then on, building by the water could no longer be only a matter of commercial convenience. It had to involve spatial discipline, risk awareness, and response capacity. In terms of coastal architecture, the result was not abandonment of the waterfront. Quite the opposite. Portugal remained deeply Atlantic. But it placed greater value on urban regularity, stronger public structures, clear access routes, separation of functions, and the organizing presence of the state in port spaces. In terms of security, the impact was broader still. The disaster taught that a coastal country must think about natural threats with the same seriousness as military threats. For that reason, the tsunami of 1755 did not redefine only Lisbon. It redefined the way Portugal imagined the relationship between city, sea, risk, and power. It did not eliminate vulnerability, but it changed the language of prevention, reconstruction, and authority. And that change began in the moment when the river withdrew, the population ran toward the quays, and the sea came back into the capital.